Hello, everyone. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Director of Communications at PFLAG National. Great to have you with us for another episode of Something to Talk About Live. As always, I have with me hosting our show, our Director of Learning and Inclusion, my friend and colleague, Jean Marie Nevada.
Liz Owen.
Jean Marie Nevada.
I'm incapable of just saying your first name. It's literally, even when I text you, it comes up as one word, Liz Owen.
I think it's really funny. I think you mentioned to me once that your phone actually now autocorrects me
It
to
autocorrects.
Liz Owen.
Liz Owen. Liz Owen. Okay. We've been together that long doing this here in our strange little pods across California.
So you can learn.
Well, thank you for getting us started because we have a really good show today with some very fascinating guests. So we should probably get to work, but I will probably see you later, Liz.
I'll leave you to it.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National, and my pronouns are she and her, or if you use Spanish, ella. Every single week, we get together to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality and inclusion. And this week, we are talking about youth, and we are also talking about the Day of Silence and using that kind of as the center for our conversation. So a couple of things. The first one is, if you'd like to read the article that we shared with our guests and that we're going to be talking about today, I encourage you to check out our website at straightforequality.org. /discussion series. And that's where you will get this week's article, which was in the American Academy of Pediatrics Voices, written by Teresitta Velez. And the name of the article was Say Gay, The Lives of Youth Depend on It. And I just want to read a tiny little piece of the article to you that is probably what really got my attention. The first line was, by the time you finish reading this piece, approximately 4 LGBTQ youth will have attempted suicide. So if that doesn't give you pause, I'm not quite sure what will. So the rest of the article goes on to talk about some of the legal challenges and legislative nonsense that is being pushed in the faces of families with trans loved ones and for trans people. And we are also this week kind of having this conversation because we are just one day before the annual observation of the Day of Silence. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Day of Silence, it was actually started in 1996. It goes back much further than most people know, by a group of students at the University of Virginia who had actually created the concept in a class project on nonviolent protest. That year, 150 students participated. And every single year since, it has really grown. In 97, it actually became a national event. Eventually, it was taken on by a national organization who has led the efforts, but it is very much a student-driven event. And every single year on that day, students will remain silent during their school day to protest the experiences of LGBTQ students, as well as the silence that many of them are forced into because of the lack of acceptance and actually active hostility towards them. So to have our conversation, to talk about what is happening out there and who can help and ways in which you can help, I want to welcome our first guest. And we actually have 2 people with us today. First, we have Deborah Levine, who is the Director of LGBTQ Youth Link at Centerlink, which is the community of LGBT centers. And we're also bringing in Lisette Trujillo, who is representing Gender Cool, which is a LGBT organization primarily focused on trans and non-binary voices, but she is also the very proud mom of a 14-year-old trans son. She's also a podcast host. She runs support groups. She is active in local advocacy. I am pretty sure she does not sleep any longer. So with that, let me bring in Deborah and Lisette.
Hi, great to be here.
Hello.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. I was really, really glad that you were both able to join us today because I think the work that your 2 organizations are doing, and specifically the programs you're working on, are probably more important than they've ever been before, given what we are facing. So not everybody knows what Centerlink does or what QChat is or what Gender Cool is. So I'm actually going to start with you, Deborah, and ask you, could you tell people a little bit about what Centerlink is? And can you explain what QChat space is?
Absolutely. So Centerlink, the community of LGBT centers, is an organization that serves over 300 LGBT centers across the United States, Canada, and beyond. You might have one in your community. We want to make sure that none of them are reinventing the wheels, so we provide support to make sure that they learn from each other and from the national resources. One of the things that came up actually before the pandemic was the need to have digital resources for youth who couldn't make it into the centers. And so we founded Q Chat Space, which basically replicates what happened at a lot of LGBT centers before the pandemic, which was support groups and discussion groups in person. And we do that online in an anonymous, safer space. All the chats are facilitated by folks who work at the youth programs at our LGBT centers.
And can I just ask one question so people know the difference? How is that space different than something like Trevor Project's crisis lines? What is the difference in those spaces?
Well, that's a really great question. It actually gets at the heart of why we founded Q Chat Space, because when we talked to youth about what they wanted to see in the digital space, they really wanted to just have a safe space to be themselves, to socialize, to get information, to learn what it means to be part of the community. Certainly there are youth in crisis and we need to address them, but a lot of youth most of the time are not in crisis. They're just needing to connect and find community and friends, and Q Chat Space really fills that niche.
Thank you. And now, Lisette, tell us a little bit about Gender Cool, and also tell us a little bit about your personal advocacy and what brought you to it.
Yeah, so Gender Cool is a nationally run organization that was founded by Jen Gross-Handler that focuses and highlights on trans non-binary youth sharing stories of families who are affirming, loving, and youth who are thriving in our communities. And it's been something that an organization that my son is very proud to be a part of.
And I think it's just so neat to have moms who are so active in these spaces. I think especially as we're seeing what people are facing out there. So, according to HRC's tracking, we have seen over 300 anti-LGBTQ pieces of legislation introduced in 2022 alone. And that definitely outpaces last year, which was pretty groundbreaking in its own terrible way. A significant portion of these, in fact, I'd say the vast majority of these pieces of legislation are really very specifically targeting LGBTQ youth. So, Deborah, I'd love to hear from you, and we'll start with you. And instead, I want to hear about what you're seeing sort of from a different lens. What has the impact of this legislation been on your work? In other words, like, how is it changing what you are seeing in the scope of your work, in the things that people need, the things people are concerned about?
So I'd say one thing that we've seen is people are now hearing more about the reality of trans youth lives, and that's really important. I mean, it's a horrible that it has to happen like this, but it is bringing to the forefront what has been true throughout, is that trans youth are not getting what they need in many places, and of course it's making the situation worse, but it is also really putting a lot of eyes onto the problem, and I think more people are aware of what's going on, and hopefully that will be a sea tide of change, there'll be pressure and push back against all of this. But in terms of impact directly on our work, our centers are continuing to serve youth. Youth are, as you might imagine, quite demoralized by this, and of course, youth who are in those states that are directly affected are really impacted, and our centers are doing what they can to support them.
Thank you. And Lisette, what about from your lens? How is what's happening externally impacting what you are seeing with the families that you work with?
Yeah, so I am a local advocate, and I facilitate a large organization of families down in Arizona. This legislative session, we were the state to have the most anti-trans legislation across the country, and 2 of them were signed the day before Trans Day of Visibility by Governor Doug Ducey. I think that what's really important for people to understand is that we've been fighting these bills for the last 3 years. So this isn't new. We've just seen the rates in which they have been spread across the country happen faster than expected. This type of legislation will continue to happen for a few more years. And it's really important for parents of trans youth and non-binary youth to educate themselves on how this legislation was created and what its purpose is. What I like to remind people is that the fact that each bill is targeting trans youth in sports and or access to medical care is very purposeful, because if you can reduce people to just their bodies, you can dehumanize them. You can talk about them in a very specific way that does not show a whole person, but a caricature. And this has been done for decades. It was done with LGBT people, right? When they were reduced to their sexuality, and you didn't see a whole person with family and life and work. And so this is just a recycle of marginalization that's been done to many communities. And it's so important for families who are, this is their new kind of touchstone or entry into marginalization, to really understand all the ways in which we intersect and we're tethered together, and why it's important for them to become educated in how to help marginalized communities move forward and push towards equality, because we can't do it alone.
Thank you for that point. I actually had not thought about it through that lens of thinking about what this legislation does. It really does reduce people to body parts, to an abstract conversation. That's a really fascinating point. Thank you so much for saying that.
And bathrooms do that too, right?
The bathroom, it totally did that, because that's all we talked about. And you completely lost the point that it was people who were going in there and people who were having terrible experiences. But you actually made a really interesting point that Arizona has faced an unbelievable number of pieces of legislation, and yet I think it has been far less visible on a national scale than states like Florida or Texas, who have certainly had their share and their passage of really bad laws. As somebody who's working in not one of the states that tends to be getting as much coverage, what do you think is behind that, and how has that played out for you? Has it made it more difficult to do the work because a lot feels like it went under the radar?
Well, I feel like I was really busy talking to reporters all ledge session, so my scope of that is sort of skewed, I think. What I always remind people is that, like, we're the three naughty siblings of the country. Like, Texas will lead, Arizona follows, and Florida does it the best. So, like, I think that it's just really important for people to understand that while you can kind of minimize it and say, well, these are Southern conservative states, it's really lobby groups that are pushing these bills forward. And what people don't realize when you hear about policy and law, they think that society has shaped that. But the reality is that lobbyists and politicians shape the way in which we think about things. And it is our responsibility as community members to engage in conversations with our neighbors, our coworkers, our family, to say, look, this is actually not the reality. The one thing that my son kept saying over and over again when he would speak to reporters or speak to local politicians is, actually, these bills are not representative of my day-to-day. I go to a school that's affirming, where I'm allowed to play sports and engage in activities with my cis peers. I have a very strong friend group, and I have a loving family. And while he faces his challenges and he has faced discrimination, I think that he sees this as not really the reality with which he and other trans kids and non-binary youth should be living in, right? Like, this is a problem in search of, as we like to say, right?
It totally is. It totally is. And Deborah, you're working with community centers all over the country. You're hearing from what they're experiencing. In terms of what you're hearing from the community centers and the people who are working in those spaces, is there frustration that some of the attention has been solely on a handful of states, and meanwhile, a lot of this legislation has moved through a number of states? We're over 30, I think it's over 32 states now have had stuff introduced. Is there a frustration around that, or do people feel like they're getting the amount of resource and the amount of attention universally that they need?
I hadn't heard frustration directly. I do imagine that locally there's probably some talk of what's going on in each place. It is sort of an unusual circumstance. I don't live in a state where these things are happening, and does feel like I've pretty much only heard about, in the popular news, heard about Texas and Florida, and it's a little bit confounding. I don't follow politics and the politicians closely enough to know for sure, but I wonder, is it those states in which they're more threatened that they're using this as a pawn? And in other places it's happening, they're doing the same. But I can't explain why we're seeing so much press coverage of just those two states. And I'm really glad to hear that Lisette is hearing from reporters, and that reporters in local areas are, and I hope the same is happening in Alabama and Carolina, and wherever it's happening, it really needs to have attention for sure.
Yeah, where it's not happening on a state level, it's definitely happening on a local level. So one of the things that I often hear people say, and as somebody who's been in this movement for a really long time, is that things have been this bad before. We faced really big challenges before. There's been discrimination before. This is just another sort of phase that we are going through. And when I hear that, I intellectually understand what's being said to me. I remember what the 90s were like. I remember what some of the 80s were like, and it wasn't fun. But I get concerned about how that plays with youth, many of whom are so young, the only world that they have known has been largely a world in which there's been acceptance, in which the White House was once lit up in rainbow colors, for example. So how do you respond to people when they say, oh, this actually is precedented, this has happened before? Because I feel like it sometimes minimizes. And maybe, Deborah, would you like to go first on that one? And then Lisette, I'd like to hear, because you're talking to a lot of youth too.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it minimizes it. You know, the phrase adultism comes to mind. It's ultimately, it really minimizes what's happening for young people. And this is true for anyone. Like, we live in our times. For someone who lived through the pandemic of the Spanish flu to say to us, oh, this has happened before, we can't do that. And developmentally, for young people in particular, this is the first time that they're coping with these things. And what we should really be doing as adults is turning to them and helping them identify what worked historically, and also, letting them know that it didn't always work, that we wish we could have made the world a place where this wouldn't happen again, and really empathize with them. I think that's what we need to be doing, not giving them, oh, this has happened before. That just feels completely dismissive of young people, and that's not what we are about.
Yeah. Lisette?
I think that there's an unfair assumption that progress is linear, and it isn't. Progress will only exist so long as we are vigilant and we continue to take care of it. I think if you are a person who has not had to deal with marginalization, you won't connect the dots. And that's troublesome, and it's also harmful. So, for example, when we look at the guidance that was put out by Abbott and Paxton regarding trans youth being supported by their parents and having DPS file cases of abuse against families and separating families. A lot of people who would look at that and say, that's impossible. Why would that ever happen? This is America. But if you look at our history, if you can criminalize a family and a parent and make them an abuser or unworthy of their child, you can take their child from them. And we saw this happen with enslaved people. We saw this happen with indigenous people. And we did see this not so long ago with migrant families, right? Mm-hmm. How dare they? Why would they ever endanger their child? It's their fault that their children are taken away from them. And where we live, we're 45 minutes away from a migrant encampment. And so, yes, this does happen because, again, if you can reduce people to groomers, abusers, then they no longer are seen as a full human being who's loving and supporting their children, and you can rip their children from them without feeling any guilt. And so it's very harmful, and it's a scary time. I really didn't think we would be here as quickly as we've gotten here.
I have to admit that I am with you. The signs were there. I just did not expect such a level of acceleration as what we have seen. I mean, and just the other day, the state of Florida issued, and I want to make very big air quotes around it, guidance on the treatment of LGBTQ youth. And that guidance was completely lacking in any kind of fact-based, accurate science. And yet it was right out of the Texas playbook too. And it created panic, and it creates a paper trail, and it is incredibly troubling that it is major government entities that are sponsoring this. So the fights that are happening are certainly happening at state levels, but they're also happening at very local levels. People are feeling it. We are getting lots of reports from even our own members who are involved in school boards who are getting threatened, who are afraid to show up at meetings sometimes because the open violence has become that bad. So I'd like to talk about what organizations are doing to respond, to some of the needs that are growing out there, because definitely this is a different permutation of opposition than we've seen in the recent future. So, Deborah, when it comes to Centerlink and community centers, what kind of resources or programs are you starting to see emerge in response to some of this to support communities?
Yeah, so to be honest, the LGBTQ community center youth programs have really suffered through the pandemic. Youth joined a lot of digital programming initially, and then, became tired of it, understandably. And in addition, we really lost a lot of the avenues that we had used to let youth know about the centers. That being and in school, encountering a school social worker or the assistant principal or the trusted teacher or the GSA advisor, or even older youth who knew about the LGBT center and had gone for services and support. And that wasn't happening because everyone was on, video for school. And so a lot of the usual avenues for word of mouth have really broken down. And we know that fewer and fewer youth, therefore, are going to the centers. So it's a little bit of a difficult moment right now to try to respond to this when youth may be much less familiar with the centers in their communities. So our centers are doing a lot of really, the grassroots outreach, letting the new social worker at the school know that they're around, what the programs are available, what support they're able to provide. And it's the same, it's worse, but it's the same. Youth have always had these needs. They need to be able to connect with others like them, to be able to figure out what it means to be part of the community. And they're continuing to really support those programs that allow youth to do that, to find the solace that they need when the community is so abusive towards them in the form of this legislation. And so it's social support groups, connecting them with counseling if they desire that, connecting them with basic services if they need those things. So our centers really are just continuing to do the work that they've done all along. And again, always the knowledge that youth really need it.
Yeah, I have to say, I live in Palm Springs, California, and our community center here has actually expanded youth programming and family programming into other parts of the valley. And a lot of it is in Spanish, which has been really exciting to see. And they've talked about how that has been some of the biggest growth area that they've had, because there is such a need, especially coming out of the pandemic, especially because of what people are facing. And that is the resource in town for people. So we're always so grateful for that. So they said, what is Gender Cool doing? What kind of programming is happening? How are people responding?
Yeah, I think that in these moments, it's when visibility really matters. And so highlighting families, diverse families with different backgrounds and viewpoints is so important. And also highlighting the humanity of our children in this moment, right? So many people say that they do not know a trans or non-binary person, and getting a visual and getting to know them and know their families that love them is really an important piece to creating change, impactful change. I always say proximity changes hearts. So, and being in proximity to somebody really, really breaks down the biases we carry about them.
It does. I actually remember the first time I ever went to a gender spectrum conference, and I just have this memory of standing at a higher point on the campus and looking down. There were all these families and all these trans kids, and I remember, everybody looked so happy, and I thought, I wish everyone could see this. You're so right. Just that proximity, and I think the work that Gender Cool is doing to bring that visibility to these supported youth is amazing, because I think it completely changes the narrative. It's hard to just think of people as a body part or a bathroom when you see a happy family, to the point that you were making. So we try to end every single conversation that we do every single week with giving people something to do. So we are looking at a time where young people in some ways have grown up with more support than any other generation before them because of things have changed. And at the same time, they are facing a tighter squeeze and some of the biggest threats that I think we can even begin to imagine. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about what people should be doing. We've got a lot of families out there. We've got a lot of allies and advocates out there. Can you both make some suggestions about, first, if you are in contact with youth, how you should talk to them about what is going on out there? And what would you suggest for everyday allies to start doing to get plugged into this work? Because obviously we need a lot of help. And maybe, Deborah, we can start with you.
Sure. So certainly talking to youth, the first question, I think, we have to visibly and actively be allies. These are things probably that most people are doing already, but you can create a safe space with your language and the actions that you take. For example, sharing your pronouns when you introduce yourself, using gender neutral language. Any of those things let people know, and particularly young people know, that you're a friend and an ally. And if you are in a situation, you fill out a form at a doctor's office, And it's only asking male or female, say something. If the school is having events or it isn't having events, call the school and offer to do something for LGBTQ History Month. So all these things I know PFlaggers always are doing to keep doing those things for sure. And certainly allying and connecting with the LGBTQ organizations in your town. Again, you're all doing that all the time, but I think that it's in those numbers that we really can do it. And then reaching out to legislators. I mean, again, these are things we do. I think that what's missing from all this legislation is the science and the stories, the real life stories, and sharing that with legislators is important. And then referring you to the resources that are available to them, like QChat Space and Gender Cool. I mean, definitely check out Gender Cool's website. You see people's smiling faces and understand what life can be like when we really affirm and support our youth.
I have to encourage everyone to do that. Definitely check out Gender Cool's website. I was actually on earlier as I was prepping for today's show. And just as I sat there just on the homepage alone, I found myself smiling because everything was just so happy and supportive. It was exactly the way it's supposed to be. So thank you for those things. And I think for people who are maybe in states where this hasn't yet happened, please pay attention to what's going on. And please, when something seems to be coming, start talking to your legislator or start talking to your legislators now. We always encourage people to develop a long-term relationship with the people who are representing them. No matter where they fall on the political spectrum, they need to hear from you. So Lisette, what do you think people should be doing? A couple of tips about talking with youth about what is happening, and also some suggestions for our allies and friends out there who want to do something.
Well, when talking to youth, I often say honesty is the most important thing, right? Talk to them about the reality of what is happening across the country in a way that is gentle and kind, but also honest, and empower them to find ways in which they can advocate for themselves and advocate for the people that they care about, their friends in classrooms or in other ways. I think that this kind of legislation can feel demoralizing, but we don't have to give into it, right? We can empower each other and hold each other up. And youth have the capacity to do that work for themselves and for others as well. What I would say to families is to make sure that your advocacy is intersectional, right? My son will always be okay because he has a family that has given him access to the things that he needs. And I have the capacity to drive him to an amazing school. There are children out there that exist that are not in those spaces and do not have access. And so if your advocacy isn't intersectional and doesn't think about BIPOC communities and the ways in which trans youth are tied to, racial equality, bodily autonomy, then we aren't doing enough. Right. And so make your work intersectional, pick up some amazing books. The Sum of Us, I highly recommend that, by Heather McGee, and start really doing the inside work necessary to bring everyone forward as we push for progress.
I love that you mentioned look sort of beyond, look into communities that are unlike your own too, and understand what some of those experiences are. I think sometimes some of our best advocates, their lens is just their lens. It's what they have seen in this space. And I think it is so critical that we are hearing stories of people who are in this space who are unlike us and hear the challenges, especially communities of color, because it's not just one challenge that you're facing. It's all the challenges all at the same time and all the time. And I think in understanding how that plays out is absolutely critical. I want to thank you both for being here. This has been such a good conversation. I've been looking at a couple of comments from people saying how much the lenses that you've provided to them to sort of refocus on this has been really important. And I want to thank you for your work. You really are out there on the front lines, and you're both actively creating spaces. And I think that's so important. So Deborah and Lisette, thank you so much. And everybody, please make sure that you are checking out Centerlink, you are checking out the QChat space, and you are checking out Gender Cool and supporting them if you absolutely can, because everyone needs a little bit of help right now. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you both so much.
Well, that gets us to the end of another show. I hope everybody is paying attention to what was said here, because this legislation, if it is not with you yet, it is on its way. And we need to be ready for it, and we need to start fighting it now. And where it's happened, we need to help turn things around. And we can all play a part in that. So we will be back again next week with another fantastic conversation. I'm really excited about the one that we're going to be talking about. It's about some new research that came out about conversion therapy, or so-called conversion therapy. We, as always, remind you that if you want to lead with love, you should always read with love. So just as a little reminder, you can visit pflag.org/readwithlove to learn more about our program, a big piece of which is making sure that all those books that are being taken off of library shelves are put back on, and you can actually help do that. So visit pflag.org/readwithlove to get more information on how to be part of that. We end the same way every single week, reminding you to run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, be kind. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. I'll be back next week. If you need any help until that time, visit us at pflag.org. Have a good week, everybody.